It's October again, which means we're now into autumn proper, and the arrival of this season, and more specifically the arrival of this month, means different things to different people. For some it means they finally get to wear those cute woolens that they bought during the summer. For some it means having to decide which of the Halloween parties they'll go to. Oh, there's so many to choose from. But for us at What Now, more important than anything else, it means we finally get to do this. Really good. I really like that. I'm gonna use that as my ringtone. Yes, good evening, my gruesome little people, and welcome back to What Now. But more importantly, it is not only What Now, because we have been invited, and by invited I mean we just sort of turned up, to take part in the magnificent Hacienda's Spooktober collaboration month thing. I'm new at this. Yes, throughout the month of October, Hacienda has invited different author-tubers and YouTubers in general to take part in collaboration videos celebrating all that is wonderful and whimsical and bone-chilling about this most autumnal and haunted of months. And yours truly is doing Creepy Week. I cannot imagine why. I am absolutely thrilled to be a part of this. All things creepy and spooky are very close to my heart indeed. I specialise in weird and creepy, spooky horror, surreal fiction writing, so that's sort of my speciality and why I laid my particular talons upon this week. But I'm very aware that this is a collaboration video, so I should very much pick up the pace here so that my video is not as long as they usually are. And the very first thing I want to do is to try and clearly define what creepy is, because what I'm going to do in this video, at least what I'm going to try and do in this video, is give the most basic elements of creepy so that you can use them in your own writing or look out for them in your own reading, viewing, playing, dating, that kind of thing. So first of all, let's get a clear definition of the basic elements of creepy before we move on to an example. Okay? Sound fun? You're a good kid. And as always, I will be fighting for auditory room with the evening traffic outside. Oh, that's good, isn't it? We all know the creeps, that under the skin sensation, the goosebumps, the hairs prickling up on the back of your hand and the back of your neck, the quite undefinable sensation that things are not as they should be. But creepy is often lumped in with other aspects of horror and fear and fright and terror and scared, and these words, while being in the same spectrum of experience, are not necessarily synonymous. I would argue that creepy, particularly in how it pertains to literature, is very much its own phenomenon. One famous example I can think of off the top of my head is Stephen King gave his definition of horror as coming home to find that everything you own has been replaced with an exact replica. Now, this is a particularly interesting idea and leads us as a sort of gateway, like a gateway drug into the idea of the creepy. Let me fetch a book. Another word that is within that spectrum of emotive and psychological ideas when it comes to literature is Freud's idea of the uncanny, a variation of which I have right here. In his 1919, is it 1919? Yes, it is. His 1919 essay, Freud gave 8 points on what makes something uncanny. That if you're familiar, of course, with the idea of the uncanny valley, this is the origin of that. And his 8 points of that unsettling, things are not as they should be, that nightmare, that surreal world that is so popular in horror films and most fashion trends at the moment are as follows. Inanimate objects mistaken as animate, so your walking dolls, your autons in Doctor Who, waxworks, automata. It says here severed limbs. I'd forgotten about that. Ooh, that's creepy. Number 2, animate beings behaving as if they are inanimate or mechanical. Trances, sleepwalkers, hypnotism, that kind of thing. Being blinded, the double, twins, doppelgangers, etc. Coincidences or repetitions. Coincidences or repetitions. We have fun here. Get out. Being buried alive, that'll do it. Some all-controlling evil genius. If you're a fan of German expressionist cinema from, well, about 1919 until the Reich started ruining everybody's fun, then you'll probably notice a lot of plot tropes coming from out of here. I mean, that is the cabinet of Dr. Caligari right there. And number 8, which is the important one, confusions between reality and imagination. This, I think, the 8th point, is the true element of what makes things creepy. Still with me? Okay. What is the difference between creepy and scary? I mean, they do complement one another very nicely, but they are separate phenomena. Here's an example. If you're sat at home, late at night, and you hear a crash and footsteps on the floor above you, and you go out and you go up the stairs and you encounter a home intruder with a bloodied hammer in their hands, well, that may be scary, that may be terrifying. Under the right circumstances, that may be the start of a lifelong friendship, but it's not creepy. Creepy would be sat in your home late at night and you hear a crash and footsteps on the floor above you. You go out into the hall, you go up the stairs, you go across the landing, you go into a room where you swear you heard the crash, and there's no one there until you hear footsteps on the floor above in the attic, but the attic door is sealed. It's that sort of thing that, ooh. Because if we boil it all the way down, if we get to the very bones and the broth of what makes creepy creepy, that idea of not being able to tell the difference between reality and unreality is key. And I think, being the point of this goddamn video, is that the two major elements, the elemental points of creepiness, are you know when your mind just goes completely blank? Yes, the two fundamental elements of creepiness are a location where the regular rules no longer apply. There is a place like the Orphic underworld where the characters enter into and things are not as they should be. And the second is having to confront and comprehend the incomprehensible. Things that shouldn't exist, existing. And everything you know about the world being pushed to the limit. You can comprehend a murderer. You can comprehend a dystopian society. Some people can even comprehend the zombie apocalypse. I've got the Discovery Channel. There's way too many people who actually think that's going to happen. But these things are comprehensible. They can be thought about. For something to be creepy, it has to have the regular laws upended in a place that allows that to happen. And it just so happens that there is one particular book, actually there's a lot of books, but I happen to have this one, that exemplifies these two most basic elements of creepiness, and it's a classic. My hot take: Arthur Conan Doyle's The Hound of the Baskervilles is the most underrated piece of gothic horror in the English language canon. Come at me. I love this book. I read it semi-regularly. I know it nearly word for word. But why, you may well ask, is Sherlock Holmes's most famous case the archetype of creepiness? I mean, sure, it's ultimately a ghost story, but it's all wrapped up in the end, and it's just a murderous conspiracy. In that respect, it's like most episodes of Scooby-Doo, except this time the dog is the bad guy. Why is it creepy? Well, for the reasons I just mentioned, you silly goose. First of all, time and place. Published in 1901, we can safely say that The Hound of the Baskervilles is the last example of Victorian sensationalist fiction. Really, quite literally, I think Queen Victoria died only a couple of months after it was published in paperback form. So it is the last of that canon that started with Frankenstein, even though that wasn't Victorian, but it was 19th century, through Jekyll and Hyde, Dorian Gray, Dracula, H.G. Wells' entire back catalogue of good stuff. It's the last example of that. And what was unique about this kind of sensationalist fiction is that it was written at a time when human beings, well, in Western society anyway, were having to confront their place in the universe in a way they'd never had to before. The Enlightenment was comparatively recent history. The Industrial Revolution was still very much in its throes. Everybody was staring down the barrel of an uncertain future, of an uncertain 20th century. But there was a general feeling that human beings were becoming more rational. Darwin had put them right back into the family tree of the planet. They were not something removed from the earth. So the ultimate rationalist hero, and it could be argued the originator of the superhero, Sherlock Holmes, is pitted against something from the old superstitious world. In terms of narrative, Holmes's biggest physical enemy was Professor Moriarty, but his biggest spiritual enemy is the Hound of the Baskervilles. This is the prototype, I would argue, of the confrontation between the rational and irrational minds that litter 20th century and 21st century fiction. But what about those 2 points I mentioned earlier? First of all, the location. If you are going to write creepy, you need that kind of Orphic underworld. If you're familiar with the myth of Orpheus, I'm sure, but for those of you who aren't, Orpheus, in order to fetch back the soul of his departed love Eurydice, has to go into the underworld, traverse its many tasks, have a wee chat with Hades, and come back again. And we use the word Orphic to describe this kind of surreal journey into an underworld, either literal or figurative, that has a transformative effect on the character or personage that goes into it. And these turn up in fiction all the goddamn time. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is one of them. A Christmas Carol is a perfect example of the Orphic underworld. But these underworlds need not be supernatural. This is where the creepy comes into it. The Gothic writers were very fond of their labyrinthine and decaying houses. Baskerville Hall being one of the most famous ones. And the House of Usher and Gormenghast being others. But the actual material of the location is not important. It's its function. It doesn't have to be a haunted house. It has to be something, though, that fits the psychology of the story. Your location, for instance, can be a relationship. People can be those locations. In our times, you have a more urban idea, whole cities, in an inner city particularly, of these underworlds. Look at Batman, for goodness sake. The many different variations that Gotham City has undertaken is a perfect example of this. But you can whittle it down into anything. The BBC series Sherlock, when they adapted The Hound of the Baskervilles, I thought Mark Gatiss did a very, very clever thing, where he identified the point of, in the 21st century, we don't have haunted houses like they did in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but we have conspiracy theories. So to make Baskerville a government facility, that was a nice touch, Mark. I appreciate that. Other people didn't, but I did. I thought that was pretty nifty. So whether you're writing it, reading it, viewing it, or if you're very lucky, living it, for creepy arenas, look for those places, those liminal borderlands where things are upended, where events are occurring and thoughts are meandering in a strange direction. Maybe the laws of physics are entirely upended. It doesn't need to be supernatural. It can be some new and unerring form of recognizable human behavior, but some separate location from the rest of the world. Islands are popular, carnivals are very popular, but something isolated, something where you can cross into and the action be removed from everyday life, or as Holmes himself describes Baskerville Hall and its environs, a worthy setting should the devil choose to take a hand in the affairs of man. And if you've ever been to Devon in the southwest of England, you'll know he's not lying. I can make that joke because most of my audience is American and has no idea what I'm talking about. The North remembers. But the second point is the most important because it has the most to do with that idea of not being able to tell the difference between reality and unreality, and that is characters who are forced to comprehend the incomprehensible, to look down the barrel of things that shouldn't exist and yet do. Here's another thing I thought that the BBC Sherlock version of the modern day version of The Hound of Baskervilles did very well, and actually did better than the book itself, was they actually made Holmes frightened. Sherlock actually has a moment where he thinks, well, no, that was real, and that is the embodiment of the purity of creepiness, that there are things, no matter how smart you are, no matter how good you are, no matter how strong you are, no matter how much you know and think and feel, there are things you do not understand, and they're gonna fuck with you. That is, I think, the embodiment of creepiness. And it's beautiful. I think this idea is summed up best in what may be the most famous line in the book. It's at the very, very beginning, when Dr. Mortimer is explaining to Holmes, he's trying to hire him for the case about the death of Sir Charles Baskerville, and tells him the legend of the Hound. And he's talking about how he found the body, and there was something else at the gate. It says, footprints, a man or a woman's. Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. I tried to get clips, but I'm not tech savvy, and when I loaded them up to crop them, it said server problem. But anyway, there we are. Let's be real for a second. Conan Doyle is one of those writers, and the 19th century was full of them. Our century is full of them. Of writers who are very, very good at story, but their writing is appalling. He's a very mediocre prose writer, but his ideas are good enough to carry it off. So when he says it's the footprints of a gigantic hound, I don't think he had the intention of being poetic enough to suggest that something from another world has walked in to yours. I don't think he was doing that. I think he just meant there's a dog and it walked. And obviously we know how it all ends. It's all a murderous conspiracy to get a hold of the Baskerville fortune. I don't think I need to put a spoiler alert on that because the book is nearly 120 years old. So, you know, statute of limitations and all that. And more or less everybody says that the ending of it is the worst part. Not because it doesn't wrap up all the pieces neatly, because it does. He's a very efficient writer. But everybody's always disappointed that it's just a dog painted to glow in the dark. The incomprehensible is made comprehensible by force in this case. Justice is done, the heroes go home, etc., etc. It's the perfect Victorian ending. Rationality comes out in the end. The vampire has been staked through the heart, and we can get back to our typewriters and steam engines. The alien invaders have been beaten by biological entities we've only just started to understand. Hooray for Darwinism. It's a perfect Victorian ending. In that respect, it loses its creepy factor, but all the pieces are in there to begin with, and I think if you revisit The Hand of the Baskervilles and look at it with a mechanical eye, you will find the elements most needed for your own creepy writing. Or you can use them as a sort of bingo card for when you're reading something and watching something in the future. That's what I want more of. I want to see... I'm all for seeing characters pushed to their physical limit, but I want to see them pushed to the limits of their imaginings, having to face things they cannot imagine but should not. The very idea of these things existing repels and offends every part of their conscious mind. And that, I really do think, is the principal element of creepiness. Characters being forced to comprehend the incomprehensible. Like if you are the most rational and deductive mind in the world and you're put against a demon dog. From small acorns, great oaks grow. Good evening.